ParaTruth. What's up, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of ParaTruth Reborn. This is a pre-recorded show on 107.7 FM in New Orleans and the United Public Radio Network. My name is Erik, and today Justin is running a little late, and honestly, he may not even be able to join us today. So we're going to hold out and hope that he shows up, but if not, we're going to have a good time anyway. So today we're speaking with Chris Carter about his book, The Case of the Afterlife. Chris Carter is an Oxford-trained philosopher and is the author of 4 highly acclaimed books and several scholarly articles. His latest book is The Case for the Afterlife, which argues that the case for the afterlife can be proven beyond all reasonable doubt entirely on the basis of evidence. So, without further ado, I introduce to you Chris Carter. Chris, welcome to ParaTruth Reborn. Thank you for joining us, for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Erik.
So the first question, I pretty much ask everyone this question, but what led you to start research on the afterlife, and why did you decide to write a book on it?
Well, this is actually my 4th book. My other 3 books are actually a lot longer. What got me started into it? Well, I guess the unusual experience of living in a house which was purportedly haunted. This was in another country, and one night a friend of mine, I was there for 2 years, and one night a friend of mine was, he's a fellow student, and he was trying to convince me to join him and 2 other grad students to spend our next year living in a farmhouse owned by our college, which lay out just outside of town. I wasn't really comfortable with the idea. I wanted to live closer to town and college, but he was very persistent, and he ended up telling me that the place has a ghost. His words caught me by surprise, and I basically said, "Has anyone seen anything?" And he said, "No, but there's been a lot of strange sounds reported." And so I headed out to the farm to see the place for myself. It turned out to be a medieval stone house, 2 stories, quite large. And while I was there on the property, I decided to speak with the college carpenter who had his workshop near the house. And after a short chat, I came straight out with it. I just said to him, "I hear the place is haunted." And he said, "Well, I don't know myself, but the carpenter before me, he swore the place was haunted." And to make a long story short, that was enough for me, and I spent the next year living there. I did see and hear some unusual things, which I could not readily explain. Nothing particularly dramatic, but these experiences did spark my interest. And so when I returned to my own country, I began to reflect on my strange experiences, and I made a visit to the local library, where I was surprised to find an enormous amount of number of books on the subject, an enormous volume of research. Specifically, most impressive was the enormous volume of research gathered by the British and American Societies of Psychical Research. These were both founded in the 1880s. The British Society was founded in 1882 by Henry Sidgwick. He was a philosopher at Cambridge. And 2 years later, in 1884, the American Society was founded by William James at Harvard University. And these 2 societies' membership list read like a who's who of the intellectual elite on both sides of the Atlantic of the day. Scientists, philosophers, historians, lawyers, scholars, and the membership included people on all ends of the spectrum, people who were diehard skeptics, people who were quite inclined to believe the data, and people who were basically neutral but open-minded. To make a long story short, despite the often repeated lie that the British and American societies never found anything, the truth of the matter is they found an enormous volume of research. Meticulous. The research was meticulous, first rate. And it was enough so that by the early years of the 20th century, almost all of the members were convinced of the reality of survival, including several of those who started off as diehard skeptics.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty incredible. Well, now, how did your background in philosophy and science actually influence your approach to this topic in particular?
Well, the strange experiences that I had in the farmhouse didn't fit in very well with some of the materialist opinions
Mhm.
of several philosophers that I'd studied. I'm sorry, but I was open-minded enough to admit the possibility that these experiences were of exactly what they seemed to be, the lingering presence of someone who'd lived in the house in days long ago.
Mhm.
Um, I guess it just affected my approach. My approach is not based upon my own experiences. My approach is basically description of various cases, an analysis, and most of all, a critical examination of the arguments of the so-called skeptics.
Mhm. Well, and with that said, what kind of reactions have you actually received from both the skeptics and the believers since publishing this book or any other works?
Mm. Well, the skeptics are not nearly as influential or as outspoken as they used to be, say
Okay.
back, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years ago. They seem to have mostly receded into the background. But it's important to remember that most of these so-called skeptics are actually militant atheists.
Okay.
And one of the fundamental pillars of the atheistic belief system is the ancient doctrine of materialism. And that's the idea that all events have a physical cause, or at least ultimately have a physical cause. And it follows from this that the mind is produced by the brain. And so when the brain is destroyed, the mind ceases to exist. Now, any evidence to the contrary threatens the doctrine of materialism and thus threatens the collapse of the entire atheist worldview.
Mhm.
And it's this more than anything else that explains their vehement opposition to the data that falsifies materialism.
Well, now, in the chapter that's titled The Mind Body Relationship, speaking of the mind, what is the evidence that indicates the actual relationship between the mind and the brain? And how, like, do they work cohesively? Are they separate from each other?
I think that the evidence indicates that the relationship between the brain and the mind is that the brain is a receiver transmitter for the mind, a two-way receiver transmitter, sometimes from body to mind, as in sense perception,
Mhm.
other times from mind to body, as in willed action. And this isn't just my opinion. This was the opinion of the philosopher William James. He argued very strongly for this. He was the first, as I said earlier, the first president of the American Society. Was also the opinion of Sir John Eccles. He won the Nobel Prize in physiology, I think, for discovering how neurons, brain cells, communicate. They do so with chemicals which cross the synaptic gap in between neurons. He called these neurotransmitters. He believed that. So did the great Canadian brain surgeon Wilder Penfield. He won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his work with epileptic patients. And today, there's other philosophers and scientists who accept this. Kurt Tugas, Bob Almeter, Neil Grossman, physicists Henry Stapp and Evan Harris Walker. So, yeah, so I think the true relationship between the mind and the brain is that the brain is the instrument of the mind.
Okay.
And the brain, Wilder Penfield described the brain as this fantastic biological computer. In other words, the mind programs the brain to handle certain automatic tasks. And we've all seen this before when learning a new skill. If you're learning how to drive a car, it takes a great deal of concentration. We have to think about everything, put the car in gear, apply the gas, look over your shoulder and all that sort of thing. But once you've been doing it for a while, then it becomes almost automatic. And we can drive the car on autopilot, so to speak. And same thing with playing a musical instrument or learning a new sport. At the beginning, it requires a lot of concentration on the basics. But after we've mastered the basics, we've programmed our brain to handle the more routine tasks, which frees up our minds for other things, such as I don't know, holding a conversation while we're driving, or thinking about how we want the music to sound. Do we want it to sound? What mood do we want to convey? Do we want to play it fast, slow? How? Or playing a sport, thinking about where we're going to place our next shot instead of how to make the shot. So yeah, I think the brain is the instrument of the mind.
So I know there's been arguments between skeptics and various scientists and believers that the mind may or may not exist without the functioning brain. Is that something in your studies that you came across, that the mind can indeed exist without a functioning brain? Would that be kind of like the spiritual realm of things? There's been discussion amongst some friends of mine that say ghosts are actually just the mind of the person that was left behind rather than a spirit. And there's been a lot of arguments about that. Where do you place that? What do you think?
Well, you mentioned a few different things there. The evidence that the brain and the mind are separate entities, and that the mind can exist apart from functioning brain. There's a great deal of evidence to this effect, and we don't even have to bring in the so-called paranormal. We don't have to bring in near-death experiences, apparitions, and so forth. I mentioned in my book the medical phenomenon of terminal lucidity. Now, this has been known for thousands of years. And, the ancient classical writers wrote about it. What it refers to is this: when someone with a diseased or damaged brain is approaching death, what often happens in the final days, hours, or minutes of their life is that they suddenly become lucid and seem to regain their normal consciousness. I mentioned a case in my book about a woman who suffered from severe Alzheimer's, so much so that it damaged parts of her brain. And she had spent approximately the last 10 years essentially doing little more than staring into space and babbling about nothing. But one day, her nurse walked into the room and found her completely lucid. She quickly phoned her daughter and explained that her mother wanted to see her. Her daughter rushed over to the hospice, found her mother completely lucid, and she said it was like talking to someone who had been asleep for 10 years. Shortly afterwards, she died, and and parts of her brain were destroyed. That's only one example. I give another example of a this is from the 19th century, I believe, late 19th century. In those days, mental hospitals were called insane asylums or lunatic asylums. And this fellow one day got a message from the director of the asylum saying this brother wanted to speak to him. Well, his brother had been little more than a vegetable for the past several years. He was intrigued. He rushed over and found his brother speaking to him perfectly normally, perfectly lucid. And the director took him aside and saying, I've seen this before. This is a sign of impending death. I don't think your brother's going to last very long. Sure enough, shortly afterwards, his brother died, and they did an autopsy on him, and they found that his brain was almost entirely suppurated, meaning that it was almost entirely filled with pus. And so this fellow's name was Surya. He essentially asked, how did this fellow, with what did this fellow think? So it's well known. This is not something that's sort of some sort of freak occurrence. It's well known among people who work with the dying. And so terminal lucidity, anyway, and I also mentioned it was this has been known for thousands of years. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, wrote about it. Galen, Cicero, and others. And they all took the view that in the final moments of life, these are cases in which the mind or the spirit, whatever you like, is disengaging from the restrictions of a material brain. That seems to be what happens, and this is mainstream medicine. This isn't. It's not necessary to bring in other forms of evidence, such as the near-death experience.
But so do you think that this is the case in terms of like individuals who might be close to dying, who say they're seeing shadows or seeing angels appear all of a sudden? Is that because their mind is now drifting into like away from the materialistic aspect of the world and it's moving into the spiritual? Or I know science says there's some sort of chemical reaction that causes those beliefs or those visions.
Okay, well, now you're moving into the so-called paranormal evidence.
Okay.
The evidence is outside of mainstream science. In my book, I discuss 5 different lines of evidence: deathbed visions, the near-death experience, apparitions, children who claim to remember a previous life, and apparent communication from the deceased via human mediums. These 5 lines of evidence are all very different from each other, yet they all point in the same direction. That essentially the mind can operate in the absence of a properly functioning brain, and after this life, we can expect a lot more.
Okay. Well, no, let's going on with the paranormal a little bit here. Like regarding near-death experiences in particular, how does the near-death experience actually support the argument for life after death? Like, is there any actual evidence there that you've come across?
The near-death experience certainly suggests that we survive the deaths of our bodies, because these are cases in which people who have no heartbeat, they're not breathing, they have no blood supply to their brain. When they're revived, resuscitated, they describe hovering above their bodies. They describe feelings of peace and joy. They sometimes describe moving through a tunnel, afterwards meeting departed friends and relatives, or mysterious beings which they can't identify. It certainly suggests that we survive death, because the NDE, I mean, because they report, first of all, it indicates the mind can operate distinctly from a functioning brain. The mind can operate and have complete, even more clear than normal lucidity at times when there's every medical reason to believe that the brain is either, the brain is simply not functioning. And also they, as I said, they report contact with departed friends and relatives. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm moving back. And forgive me, I'm going to be jumping back and forth between the paranormal and the scientific aspect of all this stuff. But what role does quantum physics or interpretations of it play into the argument for the afterlife?
Indirectly only.
Okay.
I mentioned Berkeley physicist Henry Stapp. There's another physicist, Evan Harris Walker. Both of these fellows have taken the ideas of people such as Sir John Eccles and basically run with it. Stapp, for instance, argues that the mind interacts with the brain at the level of the synaptic gap, because you've got chemicals, atoms, molecules being transferred in between over the synaptic gap from one neuron to another. And he argues that because these are events at the atomic level, quantum effects become relevant. So, I mean, I've got an appendix on quantum mechanics. The contribution of modern physics is indirect, but it is there. But also, the reason why I bring it in is because um, some philosophers, such as Daniel Dennett, will argue that dualism has to be ruled out on the basis that it would contradict physics. Well, this is complete nonsense, and so I go to some lengths to show that this is nonsense. And it's not even necessary to bring in quantum mechanics, because there's a philosopher and a physicist. He was both, named C.D. Broad. And the early years of the 20th century, he argued that you can't rule out dualism on the basis of physics, just because all physical to physical interactions require an exchange of energy doesn't mean that physical to mental or mental to physical interactions require an exchange of energy. There's no logical reason to assume that's true. So even on the basis of classical physics, pre-quantum physics, you can't rule out dualism on the basis of the science of physics.
Right. Do you think that when it comes to physics or just science in general, which often seems to want to disprove this idea of life after death, do you think that sometimes they will interpret the evidence purposely in their favor, or do you think that what they're finding actually just happens to be in the favor of, life and death not exist, or life after death not existing?
You've raised a few different issues there again. First of all, I don't think that's mainstream science is in the business of disproving the afterlife. There are scientists who are scientists tend to be open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
They don't tend to be a closed-minded bunch. The so-called materialists, skeptics, militant atheists, whatever you want to call them, they're definitely in a small minority. I mean, I'm aware of 2 different surveys that have asked scientists for their opinion on the existence of, for instance, extrasensory perception. And the vast majority of physical scientists came back and were agreed with extrasensory perception being either an established fact or a real possibility. Most of the negative responses actually came from psychologists. And if you ask these psychologists why they don't believe in extrasensory perception, they'll usually say something along the lines of, well, it would turn the laws of physics upside down. So the psychologists are saying that, but the physicists know better. Mm-hmm. They know that simply isn't true. I don't think we have evidence that the mind and the brain are distinct, and the mind can exist in the absence of a brain. I don't think there's any evidence disproving that. All the arguments that are commonly used, for instance, that, I don't know, injury to the brain can impair thinking, or Alzheimer's can impair the mind. Of course, that's true. But those things are true whether or not the brain produces consciousness or whether or not it's a receiver transmitter. I mean, I like the analogy of smashing a radio receiver. But the mistake they're making can be illustrated with the analogy of smashing the receiver radio and causing the music to stop, and then concluding that the radio was producing the music. Well, the radio does not produce the music. The radio transmits the music. I mean, just because you damage some of its components doesn't mean you damage the music. It means you damage the transmission. So brain damage, Alzheimer's, and the like certainly do not prove or not evidence that the brain produces the mind. And again, I mentioned terminal lucidity. That certainly is evidence to the contrary, that the brain operates as a receiver, two-way receiver transmitter for the mind.
Mm-hmm. And when we're thinking of like the mind existing without the brain, or even let's just say spirits walking the plains, or being able to contact these entities in particular, there is a grand number of people that claim they can do it. However, there is quite a few skeptics that say the evidence of, for example, mediumship in this case, cannot actually be trusted, and that it could be the work of some sort of satanic spirits or even a fraud altogether, especially since there's been so many proven frauds over the years. Now we have people on 2 sides of the table saying mediumship is very much real, and these people can indeed speak with the dead, and the other side saying there's no way, it's impossible. What have you found regarding that?
Hmm. Well, again, Eric, you've raised a number of
Yeah.
issues. You've raised fraud. You've raised other objections as well. Why don't we deal with one issue at a time?
Okay.
Okay, let's deal with fraud. The British and American societies began investigating both physical mediums and mental mediums. Now, physical mediums, they're the ones that purport to produce physical phenomena, levitating tables or musical instruments that play themselves, or even, the physical appearance of a deceased person, things like that. Mental mediums are different. Mental mediums either relay messages verbally or by going into a trance and writing on a piece of paper. They soon abandoned their study of of physical mediums after they exposed several fraudulent physical mediums. So, and also, physical mediumship is just too easy to dismiss on the grounds that, mistaken eyewitness testimony or malobservation or fraud. And so they abandoned that and they concentrated their efforts on mental mediums. Now, most of the mental mediums that they studied were not professional mediums. These were women of high social, almost entirely women of high social standing. One, Mrs. Verrill, she was a lecturer at Cambridge. Another one, Miss Coombe Tennant, she was Justice of the Peace and Britain's first female representative to the League of Nations, which was the forerunner of the United Nations. I can only think of one professional medium that they studied. That was a Mrs. Piper of Boston. And what they did was they were very impressed with her, and they put her on the SPR, Society of Psychical Research, payroll, so that she didn't have to do her mediumship for a living, and she could devote her time to working with the researchers. So fraud is essentially ruled out because if these are non-professional mediums, they weren't paid for their services, with the exception of Mrs. Piper. And in many cases, they wrote under pseudonyms because they didn't, when they were alive, they didn't want their names being associated with this. These are women who had careers as lecturers or as representatives to the League of Nations or what have you. They were the wives of politicians and so forth. So they kept their mediumship a closely guarded secret. So I think, given their high social standing, given the fact that they were not professionals, I think that rules out. And given the fact that the researchers were not idiots and they were not interested in physical mediumship, that rules fraud out conclusively.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to take another turn here. What are your thoughts or beliefs on reincarnation?
I'm sorry, what am I?
Your thoughts or beliefs on reincarnation?
Oh, okay. Well, as I said, in my book, I consider 5 independent lines of evidence. Mm-hmm. Children who claim to remember previous lives is one of the lines I consider. The most extensive and probably the most thorough work on that subject was done by a psychiatrist named Ian Stevenson. He applied for a grant to go to India and study this issue back in the 1960s. He took ads out in 2 different Indian newspapers asking for people with who knew of children who claimed to remember a previous life. And he investigated several of these cases, but he was only interested in active, ongoing cases. In other words, he wasn't interested in cases, I remember my brother 20 years ago when he was a kid. He wanted cases in which the children were still talking about it. They were young enough to still talk about it, and the case had not been properly investigated. So he found several of these cases, which he put together in a book, a famous landmark book, and he followed that up with more studies. He originally concentrated on India, but then he widened his scope and found cases in Western countries as well. Reincarnation is an ancient belief. I mean, it's found all over the world, not just in places like that we associate with reincarnation, like India or China or what have you. but among Australian Aborigines, several native North American tribes, the Inuit of the Arctic, some African tribes, the Vikings of Scandinavia. And I present evidence in my book that this was also found in the pagan world. There's evidence that many of the early Christians believed in reincarnation until the Second Council of Constantinople, which was not called by the Pope, by the way. It was called by the emperor, one of the Roman emperors. And so some have argued that it shouldn't be considered binding. Even today, there was a Pew Center research study, Pew spelled capital P, capital E, capital W. They surveyed American Christians, and they found that approximately 29% of them expressed a belief in reincarnation.
Wow.
I also argued in my book that there's nothing in the New Testament that rules out a belief in reincarnation. Again, many of the early Christians accepted it, and pagans. And I think that the reason why many people are sort of repulsed by the idea of reincarnation because they don't want to be trapped on endless wheel of birth and death and rebirth and life and death and rebirth. But I also present evidence that such fears are groundless. There's reason to believe that most of us only incarnate 2 or 3 times. And anyway, I'd just like to read something very briefly here,
Sure.
written by, let's see here. Okay. Yeah. Several modern theologians are arguing that, we should take reincarnation seriously. Christians should take reincarnation seriously. Let's see here. So there's theologian Geddes McGregor. He writes, reincarnation takes care of the problem of moral injustice. To that age-old question of Job, why do the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer? The reincarnationist has a ready answer. We are seeing in this life only a fragment of a long story. Death is but the end of a chapter. It is not the end of the story. And then there's Leslie Weatherhead, former president of the British Methodist Conference. He asked in his Case for Reincarnation lecture, these are his words, if I fail to pass those examinations in life, which can only be taken while I dwell in a physical body, should I not have to come back and take them again? But once we've learned the lessons of physical life, there's simply no reason to repeat them.
All right. Well, going off, because I know you mentioned, at least for a while, Christians strongly believed in reincarnation. But when you consider the Christian doctrine that, once you are saved by Jesus, you are cleansed and clear of all your sin. There is no need to do any work to grow, stronger and more righteous. Therefore, reincarnation shouldn't be necessary. What is your argument for that? Like, how do you oppose that belief? Because that's like, if Jesus washes away the sin and there's no sin to worry about, then what need is there for reincarnation?
Well, I don't think that just because somebody becomes a Christian, that means that they have necessarily learned all the lessons of earth life that there are to be learned. For example, a common Stevenson looked for patterns in the former lives of these children who claimed to remember a previous life. And what he found was a high incidence of violent death, a high incidence of dying young. So there seems to be a sense of unfinished business among these children who claim to remember a previous life. So I guess to answer your question, just because a person is a good person or a person has come to an acceptance of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, I don't think that necessarily means they've learned all the lessons of earth life that they're here to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, did you want to add anything else?
I was just going to say that all of us have room to grow.
Oh, for sure. So is there a reason why children, I know you had said that children were studied in primarily because they were young enough to still talking about their life prior, therefore they were remembered it. But modern times, like nowadays, I have even a couple of friends who have gone into therapy sessions, and they've been doing shadow work to learn why they have certain fears, and they're starting to, I guess, pull memories from past lives themselves. Now, are there enough studies on adults to like prove that they too have had a past life? Are those like, I guess, are those as accurate or as real to use as evidence, or could that be something else entirely for these people?
Well, I'm not familiar with that,
Okay.
um, with that those stories, so I
Mhm.
can't, or those cases, so I can't. I don't feel comfortable commenting on them. Most of the cases that Ian Stevenson studied involve children. These are children who normally begin to talk about being somebody else in a previous life as soon as they can begin to speak. But once they reach about 9, 10 years old, the memories fade. Once they're 11 or 12, the memories are usually almost completely gone.
Okay.
So the cases that Stevenson dealt with were children who remember a previous life, not adults who
Sure.
remember a previous life. That doesn't mean they didn't have one, of course, this is the first time they're here. That just means the best cases involve children.
Right. I will say that what I find interesting is you said how with these children, it seemed like in a previous life they had died relatively young, and therefore, and I've noticed from the case studies that I've read on adults who are going through this psychotherapy and learning about their past lives, that they too have either gone through some sort of highly traumatic injury or even a very early death, either by, being shot or in the Wild West, or, being killed by sword. So again, I mean, I just find that really interesting that it does still line up with some of the stories of these children then.
Okay. All I can really say is I don't know much about any evidence involving adults, and so I tend to be skeptical about such evidence in the real sense of the word,
Okay.
not in the phony sense. Skeptical in the sense that I'm practicing, I'm suspending belief. I'm not
Mhm.
refusing to believe.
Okay. So, what are the most common misconceptions that people have about the afterlife evidence, and how do you usually address them?
Hmm. Well, I already mentioned one.
Mhm.
That's the often repeated lie that the British and American societies investigated and found nothing. They found an enormous volume of research. There's a library in England. There's a library in Boston, I think. I think that the ASPR library is still open. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But they found an enormous volume of research, and they gathered it into journals. The British American, the BSPR journal, the Journal of the American Society of Psychical Research. So that's one misconception, and I think that's sort of like saying, well, don't bother to look at the evidence because there's nothing there.
Right.
There's an awful lot there. As I said earlier, that's one misconception. Another misconception is there is no evidence. It's all a matter of faith. No, it's not a question. It's not a question of faith. It's a question of evidence. And on that topic, I just want to read something else. The British and American societies, the membership also included clergymen. And one of them was the Reverend Charles Drayton Thomas. He was a Methodist minister, an active member of the British Society of Psychical Research, and he participated in many sittings with renowned mediums. And he wrote once, these are his words, "Perhaps it will be asked what benefit may be expected from a general acceptance of this evidence for survival. I think it will do for others what it has done for me. It has supplemented and reinforced my faith, both in times of bereavement and in the prospects of old age and death. Also, it has further emphasized the value of personal religion." So there is no conflict between Christian belief and the evidence. They supplement and reinforce each other.
Mhm. And forgive me if you said this at the beginning of the show, but do we know why the British American like lied about the evidence that they found?
Uh, what? The membership of the British and American societies never lied about the evidence they found. It's the materialists, the so-called skeptics who have often remarked, "Oh, those societies found nothing." Those
Oh, I
societies
see what you're
found an
saying.
awful lot. Yeah.
Okay. I apologize. I thought you were saying that they had lied about it, about all
No,
the
no.
books and stuff that they found.
Found. No, no, no. They wrote the books. They wrote
Got
the
it. Got
journal
it. Got
articles. They wrote the studies. They built the libraries. They conducted the research.
it. Mhm. Well, now, how do materialistic worldviews limit our understanding of consciousness and survival?
Well, I guess they give us this enormous blind spot. I don't think we should go through life wearing blinkers, just ignoring evidence that doesn't fit in with our preconceived ideas. I know that's certainly the easier path.
Mhm.
It's always difficult to change our minds, change our opinions. Um, Most of us regard our opinions as valued personal possessions. And so the normal human instinct is to try to hold on to them and defend them against any sort of challenge. But there's nothing here to be afraid of.
Mhm. Well, now, if consciousness uh, does survive death, like, what does that mean? Do you think? What does that mean for how we live our lives now or going forward? If like everybody just believed that, what do you think we should be doing?
Well, one of my appendices, I've got 6 appendices in the book, and one of the appendices is why does what we believe matter?
Mhm.
Yes, it's Appendix 3. I'm looking at it right here. Um, is that essentially what you're asking me? Why does what we believe matter?
Yeah, yeah. If consciousness exists after death.
Yeah, well, because what we believe determines to a large extent how we live our lives here and now. Um, I mean, I mentioned the philosopher in this Appendix 3 who mentions this, and I mean, obviously, such a belief can overcome the fear of death and extermination.
Mhm.
So, if nothing else, it can help us put that fear aside and allow us to get on with living our lives without that fear lingering in the background. Um, he mentions 5 other benefits, but uh, again and again, the communications coming through mediums stress the importance of realizing that this life is not all there is, and that, well, I think there's someone named Julia who communicated through a journalist named W.T. Steed. Steed went down with the Titanic, but before he did, in the years before that, he actually discovered he was a gifted medium, and he put together this book titled Letters from Julia, which are a
Mhm.
series of communications from a young woman who died that he knew. And one of the letters is like this, where Julia stresses great importance on knowing more about the true reality. And this is the part of the message that came through. You may think it strange that the verification of another life should increase the importance of this, but such is the fact, and you can never understand the importance of your life until you see it from this side. You are never, for one moment, idle from influencing eternity.
Mhm. Well, do you think that belief in the afterlife has ethical or societal consequences?
I Personally, I think so. I mean, think about again, what we believe determines how we live our lives depends to a large extent on what we believe comes after it,
Mhm.
and what we believe to be the nature of the universe. So, um, think about what we're doing to the environment right now. I mean, we're damaging our we run the risk of irreparably damaging our ecosystem, putting our entire civilization in grave danger. The problem, of course, if we reach what's called tipping points, points of no return, essentially. Um, One of the simplest examples I can think of is with regards to melting of the Arctic ice caps. Now, the snow caps, the snow and ice of the Arctic, being mostly white, it reflects the sunlight coming in.
Mhm.
But because of global heating, they are beginning to melt, and that's doing two things. One thing it's doing is it's exposing the soil underneath, in which methane is trapped, and the methane is also heating up and being released into the atmosphere. Methane is even more potent gas at global heating than carbon dioxide, and so the more methane is released, the more the Earth heats, the more the polar ice caps melt, the less sunlight is reflected from the polar ice caps back into space, the more methane is released, and so on in a vicious circle.
Mhm.
That's one example. If we reach the point where that process becomes almost irreversible, that's a tipping point, a point of no return. It reinforces itself. More heating causes more polar ice to cap, more methane released, less sunlight released back into space, higher temperatures, more melting of the polar ice caps, more methane released, less sunlight reflected back into space, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So these are the sort of things that keep climate scientists up at night. Um, Many of them, you talk to them and you feel a sense of desperation in their voices, or a sense of almost panic. We can't cross these tipping points, because if we do, then all bets are off. Now, all these people are saying, mostly people who are lobbyists for the oil and coal industries, they're saying that, global, they're trying to raise doubt. I call them
Sure.
merchants of doubt. They're not trying to prove that global heating is not man-made. They're saying, the science is inconclusive. It hasn't been settled. There's no consensus. There's arguments on both sides. There are no good arguments on the other side. The planet is heating up, and all the evidence suggests that we're doing it with our emissions. But why would these people be doing it? Well, obviously, because they benefit financially from the production of fossil fuels, either directly because they work for these companies, or they're shareholders in these companies, or they own these companies, or they're being paid to lobby for these companies. But if you believe that death is not the final word, then this life is not all there is, and it changes our definition or our idea of what it means to play the long game.
Mhm.
In other words, the game doesn't end with our deaths. And so we should be concerned about the fate of the planet and future generations, and not simply uh, just live for our own lives,
Right.
or live for ourselves.
Right. I totally agree with you. I was while you're talking is making me think of like during COVID, when everybody, the whole road is pretty much shut down, and how many of the waters in Venice started to clear up and dolphins started coming in. They haven't, been spraying those waters for years and years and years. And we've seen pollution at that time kind of subside, and the ozone started to shrink a little bit. Um, and it amazes me how often people will talk about global warming, or certain animals going extinct, or the amount of pollution within the Indian Ocean, or just in the oceans in general for that matter, uh, and yet they don't seem to care. Like, I watch people, I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and I watch people driving down the street. They'll take a bag of McDonald's, just toss it out the window. It's all their garbage just hitting the ground, and they keep on going. And I see it over and over and over again. Um, and it really, I think it's sad, because these individuals are, they think, oh well, even if it is real, if global warming is happening, if these animals are going extinct, if the world is as polluted as it is, the tipping point isn't going to happen in my lifetime, so who cares? And that just goes right along with what you're saying, that we need to focus on future generations and what the earth is going to be, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years from now. And sadly, there's so much selfishness, I think, in some of these people that live in this world, that they just, they're ignorant to it. Or they just simply don't care.
Yeah, well, the great novelist George Orwell, I think he expressed it quite well. He said, what was it now? The greatest The greatest threat to mankind is the decay in the belief in personal immortality. Um, I think that a lot of these people who are militant atheists and are hostile to the idea of religion, hostile to the idea of an afterlife, these are people who don't want to be held accountable for their lives.
Mm-hmm. It's just wild. It's boggling to me, you know. So we're kind of getting close to the end here. So I got just 2 more questions for you. But first and foremost, what, if anything, would you want your readers to take away from this book in particular?
All right. I guess that see, this is my 4th book, and all 4 of my books are attacks on the skeptical fortress. If the first 3 can be thought of as an armada, then this one is more like a surgical strike. It's much more focused, much more. It's basically a lot more focused. It's shorter. I think it's important to realize that if a person is familiar with the best evidence for survival, and has the tools that I give people in the toolkit, because my first part of the case for the afterlife, it's called the toolkit, and I give readers the tools necessary to evaluate the evidence and the skeptical objections. Then the supreme irony of studying the skeptical objections is that it results in an even greater conviction that we survived the deaths of our bodies, because we realize that the counter arguments are all very, very flimsy. Do not stand up to critical scrutiny.
All right. Well, my final question is just want to give you the opportunity to share, where people can find you, where they can find your book, anything that you'd like to share. The floor is all yours.
Okay. Well, the book is titled The Case for the Afterlife. It's available on Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, Amazon.uk, and various other outlets too. Goodreads, a few others. It's also available at fine brick and mortar bookstores where I like to shop, such as Barnes and Noble. It's not hard to find. Oh, they can also go to the Llewellyn website, my publisher's website, and maybe later on, Erik, you can provide a link.
A link for it, absolutely, 100%.
A link for it. And if they go to the Llewellyn website, they can read a description of my book. They can read endorsements of my book from fairly well-known individuals in the field. And they can also read a short essay that I wrote. I think it's called "Can We Prove that we survived the deaths of our bodies," or something like that. It's basically a short essay which will give readers a good idea of how I write and what my book is all about.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure talking to you and getting your thoughts on all of this. It's been awesome.
Yes, thank you, Erik.
All right. Well, you have yourself a good night. And probably like around next week, I will get you the link to this particular show and let you know the exact time it releases.
Okay, I appreciate it. Are we still recording? Are we still recording?
I am pausing right now. All right, folks. So that was Chris Carter on his book, The Case of the Afterlife. Make sure you check out this book. If you don't have it already, you should definitely go to llewellyn.com or any of the other sites. We're going to have links down here in the descriptions for you. Make sure you click on those and check it out. It's a pleasant read. It's fascinating. And if it doesn't just blow your mind, some of the evidence that is in there, I don't know what to tell you, but definitely check it out, y'all. So with that said, unfortunately, obviously you guys saw Justin did not join us today. He was busy with some work-related stuff. So he will be joining us again next week, of course. So just make sure you like, share, subscribe wherever you listen to the show. Also, make sure to check out the other shows on United Public Radio Network. We just want to build a community of listeners and show hosts here. So again, this has been a pre-recorded show on 107.7 FM New Orleans and United Public Radio Network. So until next week, where you will find us at the same time on the same channel, my name is Erik. Peace.